So welcome everyone. Hello, bonjour. We are pleased to have you join us for this special leadership coffee chat as part of Canadian Environment Week. My name is Megan Poss and I am the Director of Leading Change Canada. For those on the line for whom this is your first touch point with Leading Change, we're a national nonprofit that supports emerging environmental leaders and young professionals. We operate in a constellation model with 3 other Canadian sustainability organizations, the Delphi Group, the Globe Series, and the Excel Partnership. We all have our own respective missions, but we share a common vision, and that vision is a sustainable, prosperous, and socially just future within a generation. Now, arriving at a socially just future requires building and sustaining relationships with Indigenous peoples. And while we're uprooted and convening in digital spaces, we wanted to take a moment to ground ourselves in acknowledging the importance of land, especially in the context of a conversation on biodiversity, nature-based solutions, and climate change. And if you know the land or treaty you're situated on, please feel free to type it in the chat box and take a moment to give thanks to the original stewards of the land. And if you don't know much about the land you're currently on, we encourage you to use this time while we're in a collective moment of reflection and resetting to educate yourself. And we'll share a few resources in the chat box to help get you started. Now, before I introduce our moderator, it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge the relentless acts of anti-Black racism and violence that we continue to witness across Canada and the United States. As an organization that holds integrity as a core value of which young Black and Indigenous environmental leaders are among our constituency, we stand unequivocally against any form of racism, including environmental racism, whether it is insidious, overt, violent, or systemic. And there are many ways for us to take action and create change, including engaging in dialogue and exploring ways we can make policies and systems more equitable. Leading Change is actually pivoting to offer these arenas for dialogue year-round, and we welcome any suggestions for how we can use our platforms to elevate the voices of others and all young people who want to be part of the low-carbon transition. I'm now going to pass the floor on to Dominique Cerise, our moderator for this conversation. Dominique is the co-founder and executive director of Youth Climate Lab, as well as a Leading Change alumni and a frequent collaborator of ours. So over to you, Dominique.
Thank you, Megan, et un beau bonjour à tout le monde qui nous rejoint en ligne. Moi, je vous rejoins du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin, mais nous sommes tous ici dans le cadre de la Semaine canadienne de l'environnement pour discuter des liens entre la protection de la nature, la biodiversité, les changements climatiques et la prospérité économique. So I'm the co-founder of a Youth for Youth lab that is focused on transformative climate action. We design and pilot projects that enable young people to create the just climate futures they deserve. And a lot of our work is focused on challenging ourselves to be better allies and centering the voices and issues of those on the front lines. So it's important for me to name that this coffee chat is happening at a time where people around the world are standing up against anti-Black and systemic racism in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm reminded of what Dr. Cornell West has said, that justice is what love looks like in public. And I think when thinking about this and preparing for this, it really resonated with me because I think we're all here because of our love for nature, for people, for our neighbors, for our futures, for our kids and the future generations to come. So I want to remind us that a just recovery that centers people and disrupts business as usual is really the only way we're going to recover from COVID-19. And I'm really excited for us to have this chat today because it really is a real opportunity to bring forward some of the questions and ideas from young people who care deeply about these issues and who will inherit the decisions of today's politicians. And we're really excited and want to thank Minister Wilkinson and his office for their time today. It should be a great conversation. And so before we get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items and expectations. The format of this discussion is a virtual fishbowl where you'll be observing the conversations and questions from our 14 youth representatives. We won't have time to take audience questions, unfortunately, but we do encourage you to engage with the dialogue. There's a chat box located at the right of your screen that you can use to engage in discussion with each other. And if you're having any tech issues, you can add your questions in the chat and our tech support will help you out. And for anyone that may need to leave early, we'll be recording the conversation. And I do want to remind us that this is a short call with lots to cover, so we encourage everyone to be respectful of time and to each other's ideas. Je tiens aussi à noter que la conversation se déroulera en anglais, mais si vous voulez, s'il vous plaît, demander des questions en français. And so with that, I would welcome the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change for the Government of Canada. Minister Wilkinson, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you very much. Bonjour tout le monde. I should start by saying that I am speaking from the traditional territories of the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in beautiful North Vancouver. I also, while I'm going to speak mainly about the environment, do want to acknowledge the terrible event that happened in Minneapolis and you know the triggering of what is, I think, a pretty important conversation around systemic racism, not just in the United States, but in this country and in other countries around the world. J'espère que vous restez en santé à la maison. Je vais dire quelques mots pour ouvrir cette session qui sera largement interactive. J'aimerais entendre vos idées et vos questions. D'abord, j'aimerais souligner que c'est la semaine de l'environnement, une semaine annuelle de sensibilisation sur l'environnement. On souligne souvent cette semaine avec des activités extérieures, mais cette année, c'est différent. We are certainly living through some extraordinary times, and many have suffered significant personal losses. All of us have had to make enormous changes in our daily lives, and even as we keep safe at home, many of us with loved ones, it has been certainly a challenging time. We've had to adapt to many changes in the way we work, the way we live, and certainly the way we think about who we are in the world. La plupart d'entre vous avons fait la transition vers le télétravail et plusieurs rencontrent des défis additionnels. La pandémie occasionne des défis importants pour tous les Canadiens, mais certainement l'incertitude est particulièrement difficile pour les jeunesses. Ma fille cadette a terminé ses études secondaires cette année. Ce n'était certainement pas la deuxième année à la reprise des diplômes qu'elle avait imaginé. The health and safety and the well-being of all Canadians is certainly the Government of Canada's top priority. And we have been working very hard over the past few months to ensure that Canadians have the support that they need during these very difficult times. There are kind of three phases to this challenge that we've been going through. The first is combating the virus, and that meant not only putting in place various measures to address the virus, physical distancing, restrictions on various activities, but also providing the supports that enable people in this country who are losing their jobs to be able to put food on the table, pay their rent, to ensure that small businesses would be able to survive through this. And so the government has made some very significant investments, and it has acted with speed. And I would say that the actions certainly were not perfect, but to be perfect, they would have taken many, many months to develop. And so the conscious decision the government made was to act with speed to ensure that people were able to feed their families. The second phase we're in right now is the relaxation phase, which is a bit different in different provinces. That is a relaxation phase that needs to be rooted in science and the advice of medical professionals. But it is the beginning of us moving back to something that will approximate a new normal. A new normal because until there's a vaccine, there won't be an ability to do some of the things that we probably took for granted in the past. And the third phase is really the recovery. And that really is starting to think about some of the damage that's been done, but also about the type of society that we want to see going forward. It is a bit of an opportunity to take a step back. And I think that COVID-19 has laid bare a number of challenges that were existing, but maybe were not things that we were talking about as much as we should have. So things like our social safety net in Canada. Employment insurance covered a lot more people 20 or 30 years ago than perhaps it does now. The importance of connectivity for remote and northern parts of this country. And some of the issues around supply chains with respect to medical devices and medicines, as well as food. There's a range of those things. La pandémie nous fait voir l'importance d'agir rapidement et de façon décisive contre les menaces mondiales auxquelles nous faisons face. Certainement, deux menaces majeures qui se profilent à l'horizon sont le changement climatique et ses impacts et le déclin rapide de la biodiversité. We are going to need to address the issues around climate change and the global decline in biodiversity as part of any long-term recovery strategy. Before COVID-19, this government had made some historic investments with respect to the Pan-Canadian framework to address climate change, but also with respect to biodiversity and protected spaces, and significant actions with respect to protecting species at risk. Going forward, we're going to need to do a lot more if we are going to avoid the devastating impacts of runaway climate change or rapid biodiversity loss. Canadians are going to be looking, I think, for their leaders, irrespective of their partisan affiliation, to act thoughtfully in a manner that enhances sustainability and promotes clean growth and prosperity, in a manner that's going to lay the foundations for building this kind of society that we need and that we want. J'ai eu la chance de travailler dans plusieurs secteurs pendant ma carrière. Comme plusieurs d'entre vous le savez, immédiatement avant de me lancer en politique, j'ai passé presque 15 ans en technologie verte, à travailler sur les solutions pour répondre à la crise climatique. I entered politics because I was concerned about the future of the planet, and certainly I was concerned about the future that my daughters would inherit if, in fact, we did not address and raise the level of our ambition. I am very saddened, certainly personally, and I know we all are, by the impacts that COVID-19 has wrought. But I am also quite energized by the opportunities that I think are available to us at this time to make transformative change. To be successful, such change will require a lot of thought, dedicated work on the part of interested Canadians of all ages and of all walks of life. Certainly the issues under discussion, as Dominic said, should be of particular importance to young people who will inherit the product of what is done or not done in the coming years. Groups like Leading Change have been very active and a very productive part of the conversation in Canada, and I think internationally as well. And so I look forward to talking about these issues and others with you over the course of this session and many, hopefully, sessions to come.
Great, thank you, Minister Wilkinson. So I'd now like to introduce my peers from across the country. So if you can each briefly say your name, your title and organization, and where you're calling in from. We'll kick off alphabetically, first with Alan.
I'm Alan Shapiro, calling in from Coast Salish Territories in Vancouver, British Columbia. I am an instructor in the Sustainable Business Leadership Program at BCIT, and really glad to be here today.
Alan, Bo?
Hi everyone, my name is Bo and I'm co-founder and CEO of Aquafort. I'm based in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Great. Christy?
Hi everyone, my name is Christy McLeod and I'm the founder and director of Human Rights Hub Winnipeg and an articling student at Miller Thompson LLP. And I'm calling in from the unceded, ancestral, occupied traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations of the Coast Salish people in the city of Vancouver.
Derek?
Hi everyone, excited to be here. Derek Masters, I work at Sustainable Development Technology Canada, where I'm an investment analyst, and I'm based here in Ottawa.
Devin?
Hi everyone, my name is Devin Fernandez. I am Humber College's sustainability specialist, and I'm also the co-founder of the Kitchener-Waterloo Library of Things, and right now I'm based in Toronto.
George?
Hi, so happy to be here. My name is George Benson. I'm the sector manager for the built environment with the Vancouver Economic Commission. I'm also the co-founder of the nonprofit, the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project. Speaking to you here from the unceded and traditional territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in Vancouver, BC.
Hassan?
Hi everyone, Hassan Morali calling in from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, and Musqueam nations in North Vancouver, BC. And I'm a student in the Interdisciplinary Studies program at Capilano University.
Helen?
Hello everyone, I'm Helen Watts. I'm the Director of Innovation and Partnerships at Student Energy. And I'm calling in from the unceded traditional Coast Salish land of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people in the city of Vancouver.
Jonathan?
Ani Bojo, Jonathan Arujo Redbird, Ojibwe from Wacomicongo, unceded First Nation. I'm the co-founder of Pontiac Group, Inc., and currently completing my master's at Queen's University.
Caitlin?
Hello, Coop friends. I'm Caitlin Herchak. I'm the Indigenous Governance Officer at VIDEA and the Deputy Chair of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. And I'm calling in from the unceded traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people here in Victoria.
Natasha?
Hello, Tanshi, everyone. I'm Natasha Donahue. I'm the president of the Athabasca University Students Union. I'm calling in from Barhead, Alberta in Treaty 6 territory.
Great. Paninda?
Hi, everyone. I'm Paninda Pinch, Sustainability Consultant with the Delphi Group, and I'm calling in from Brampton, Ontario.
Robin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Robin Cecil. I'm calling in from Treaty 7, Calgary. I'm a sustainability consultant and principal consultant of ICDAR Sustainability. I'm also the co-founder of the Climate and Environment Steering Committee for the World Economic Forum's Global Shaper Community. Glad to be here.
And last but not least, Spencer?
Hi, I'm Spencer Chason. I'm an environmental coordinator at the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and also I'm completing my master's in biological oceanography at UBC, and I'm calling from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people in Vancouver.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. This is my first time moderating a virtual coffee chat, so I have my coffee and really excited to be chatting with you all today. So just for the audience to know, these amazing speakers have been selected based on their expertise really in three main areas: Indigenous knowledge, nature-based solutions and cultural shifts, financing and rebuilding, and Canada's climate targets, just economic recovery, and role of youth. So we're ready to kick off with some of the questions and conversation starters that our participants have prepared. And Caitlin, do you want to kick it off for us?
Sure. Hi, Minister. So good to see you again.
Thank you.
My question for you is, how are you planning on creating an equitable way to ensure Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge keepers are included in Canada's nature-based solutions agenda? And how can youth and communities be included?
So it's a very good question. I would say that you know, we took the first steps on that in terms of acknowledging the importance of Indigenous knowledge and the inclusion of Indigenous voices in the legislation that we passed in the last Parliament in what are called Bill C-68 and Bill C-69, which is really the Fisheries Act and the environmental assessment process, the new impact assessment process, which requires the consideration of Indigenous knowledge and requires the active participation of Indigenous communities in those reviews. But certainly as we move forward with respect to nature-based solutions, I mean, it is obviously related both to climate change and to biodiversity. And if you think about what nature-based solutions are about, they're about protecting and conserving, but they're also about restoring ecosystems. And certainly on the protection side, as you know, we made some pretty significant commitments in the first term to protecting both marine and terrestrial areas. And we've made even bolder commitments in the last election, which is 25% protected by 2025 and 30% by 2030. I would tell you that Indigenous communities have been critical to the path that we've been on in terms of the success we've had in creating more in the way of protected spaces. So Indigenous protected areas, new concept, which has actually been, you know, a critical enabler to protecting spaces that are important to Indigenous communities, but also important from the biodiversity, broader biodiversity perspective. Places like Jumbo here in British Columbia, which was an issue for 30 years, which is now a protected area. The Tanaha people have led all of that. Tilyutupimanga, which we protected with the Inuit leadership in the north, Edaje, a national park now in the north, all were Indigenous led. I think the Guardians programs that we've brought into place around conservation have been important, both in terms of advancing conservation generally, but also bringing Indigenous knowledge much more directly into that conversation. And certainly, I think a bunch of the pieces of work we've done on species at risk, including the recent agreement that we signed here in British Columbia with West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nations around restoration and the overall protection and conservation of the species, was really positive. So my view would be that we absolutely have been and will continue to weave Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voices into that conversation.
Thanks, Minister.
Great, thank you. I'll pass it over to Robin to follow up on that question.
Hello, Minister Wilkinson. So my question is around measurement tools. So as we know, GDP is typically a one-dimensional measurement or metric that excludes the well-being of the most vulnerable populations in our country, as well as our planetary health. And so what are the government's plans to track and measure the well-being of all Canadians, specifically for vulnerable and Indigenous communities? and the natural assets on which our societal and economic well-being depend on? And what are, and if there are any specific regulations that are planned for public and private sector reporting that would be put into place to support this?
So I guess I would say a couple of things. I mean, at the highest level, you talk about, GDP not being a measure that actually fully reflects a number of the important things in our society. And I would agree that that's true. And there are countries and subnational governments around the world that have actually started to move pretty aggressively in the direction of recognizing the broader set of issues around well-being. So New Zealand has certainly probably been the leader in that, but Scotland and a number of others have. You probably are aware, but the Associate Minister of Finance, Mona Fortier, has an element in her mandate letter which relates to looking at some of these issues, because I think our government certainly agrees that we need to go beyond GDP in terms of measuring success as a society. And so we're quite actively thinking about that on a go-forward basis. I think in terms of specific, though, measurements around environmental kind of related impacts and dependencies, we probably are farthest along with respect to climate change, where we are focusing very much on financial disclosure with respect to climate change for all of the operating entities, companies, and others that will be doing business here. We are working through the development of carbon offset systems to try to ensure that we can actually, from a monetary perspective, recognize the value associated with conservation and with stewardship, including agricultural stewardship. So that is sort of the first step. I think that as we move forward, we probably will need to broaden that, but that's probably the biggest area of focus at the present time.
Thank you, Minister. And as a follow-up, I'd ask Spencer or Devin to chime in.
Thank you. I think this is a good segue to your answer, Minister, because you had mentioned the Impact Assessment Act and the changes to that. We know that project-based assessments are not as an effective tool at addressing cumulative impacts, particularly for biodiversity, and they're not as effective at integrating nature-based solutions. We know that regional assessments are a better tool for that. Are there any plans to move forward on using that tool more, or even making it a requirement for some regions?
Yeah, so I mean, you will know in the new Impact Assessment Act, we built in a couple of things. One are continued project-specific assessments, and I do think those are important because that's where you really do pick up the very specific impacts that a project will have. But you're absolutely right that they often do not pick up cumulative effects, and when they do pick them up, they pick them up in a very suboptimal way, right? Where you may have a project that has very limited impacts, but that you're right at the threshold with respect to cumulative effects. And so you have a kind of a very perverse conversation at sometimes where you actually probably have a project that is worthy of proceeding, but in the context of cumulative effects, it's very difficult to justify. So we did create the tool of regional assessments in the Impact Assessment Act. At this stage, we are not applying that everywhere, but the way I see it applying is in areas either where there's a reasonable amount of industrial activity so that you actually are running into some of these issues around thresholds from a cumulative effects perspective, that you designate that from a regional perspective before you actually have new projects coming forward. So we're thinking about all of that. Or pristine areas where people are proposing projects, and if you do them one-off, you're going to end up with almost certainly suboptimal outcomes. So for example, I just designated a regional study in what's called the Ring of Fire in Ontario, which is the northern part of the province. There are a number of companies that are interested in developing mines, but the last thing you want is every company that's developing a mine, assuming that you actually permit the mines, developing their own road network and developing their own, series of supporting infrastructure, because at the end of the day, every road that goes into that area is a problem for boreal caribou, for example. And so thinking about things at a higher level from a regional perspective can help us to think about how we design how we design infrastructure better. So I think those are two different cases, and that's exactly what the Impact Assessment Act was intended to do, was to allow us to look at some of those things.
Thanks
As you will know, actually, because you work at the port, I mean, this is one of the challenges the Robert Bank faces is cumulative effects, right? Is the volume of activity that's going on. So, yep.
Great.
Thank you so much, Minister.
Robin, you have a quick follow-up question.
Yeah, just a question, I guess. Totally see how Canada is incorporating things like TCFD into reporting requirements with the just recovery. But I guess specifically talking about biodiversity and nature conservation, are there specific plans there to help further reporting requirements and measuring that well-being?
Yeah, I mean, certainly they're sort of two separate things. I mean, there's protected spaces, and then there's biodiversity decline, and they're obviously completely interrelated. I mean, if you actually have more protected spaces, you probably have less biodiversity decline, because habitat is the biggest driver with respect to the sustainability of biodiversity in most cases. And so we're definitely measuring our ability to actually move towards the targets that we've established in concert with other countries around the world with respect to protected spaces. As you know, the targets that we had for 2020, which was 10% marine and 17% terrestrial, were HE targets. So they were agreed upon between countries around the world. We are now leading, in conjunction with others, the call for 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. And that's a easily measured sort of metric as you move along the path. In terms of just measuring biodiversity, yes. We have a Species at Risk Act in Canada. Has never been particularly well implemented, I would say. And we are increasingly putting resources into ensuring that not only are we doing what the Act tells us we need to do, but starting to move towards being able to actually look at really critical areas. So the focus right now is really on priority spaces, priority places, typically those that are rich in biodiversity, where you have multi-species that you're concerned about, and priority species, and being able to actually provide information on a much more frequent basis as to the health and the status of biodiversity in that context. So that is definitely work that's going on right now.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to switch gears now to talk a bit about financing. Jonathan, you have a question for the minister from an entrepreneur's perspective.
Yes. I'm an Indigenous environmental and social impact champion, and I'm experiencing difficulty in raising capital from my local investors, as the current unbalanced economic environment is causing much uncertainty, creating a high-risk environment. My question to you, Minister Wilkinson, is, can you and your office influence Minister Bill Moore to provide a national refundable or non-refundable tax incentive to attract investors to environmental and social impact organizations, enabling Canadians to support grassroots initiatives that support people and planet?
So let me just step back a little bit. So, I mean, certainly raising money for early stage enterprises is never easy. I ran tech companies before I got into this. They were environmental tech companies, so I have some understanding of your situation. And I would say that traditional financial investors, particularly venture capital investors or angels, are almost exclusively financially motivated, right? And so they do look for very high returns, in part because they invest early on and the risks are very high. And you will know this very well, but there's sort of the traditional investors, and then there's the responsible investors, who are people who have screens in terms of what they're willing to invest in, but they're still looking for fairly high levels of return. And then there are more the social investors, where they are willing to take potentially a lower rate of return, as long as there are associated either social or environmental benefits. We have done some work over the course of the last few years in trying to actually figure out how to do more on the social investing side. You'd be aware we created the Social Finance Fund, I think, in 2018, which was, I don't know, it was like $700 million or something like that, trying to leverage more money out of the private sector. And I do think that we need to continue to think about how that fully gets implemented, but how we can do more on the social investing side, because I agree with you. It's not traditional sources of finance that you're likely going to be successful unless your business is going to generate, you know, extremely high returns. So that's a conversation I'm certainly willing to continue to engage. It wasn't sort of in my area of responsibility, but it's certainly something I'm actually personally interested in. So I'm certainly willing to continue that conversation.
Thank you.
Great. And I think Bo's question is really a great follow-up.
Yeah, Canadian issued green bonds have done incredibly well on the market, showing great return on investment. And in fact, ESG related investments have done incredibly well during this pandemic. We've also recently seen broader global investment focus on freshwater and ocean resources. So my question to you, Minister Wilkinson, is how will the federal government use blue bonds or other financial mechanisms to support ocean and freshwater resources across Canada?
So it's an interesting question. Before I was asked to become Environment and Climate Change, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I was Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. So I spent a little bit of time dealing with some of these issues. In fact, when I was in that role, Canada co-hosted a Blue Economy conference in Kenya with the Kenyan government. It was quite a conference. There were 18,000 people who came to the conference, and there was a lot of interest on the part of developing countries in this concept of the blue economy. I think that there are a couple things. I mean, I think that it's certainly an idea that's worth investigating, but you have to sort of understand the constraints, as I'm sure you do. I mean, the green bonds have tended to work reasonably well, in part because they have been able to generate reasonable economic returns, right? I mean, people who are actually putting money into the bonds are expecting a return. So in the context of the blue economy, you need to find the kinds of projects that actually will have the kind of revenue stream that will give you the returns that your investors will accept if in fact you're wanting to go down that path. And then there are probably other sources of funding that we need to be thinking about, which is to do projects that are actually just important to do, but don't necessarily have the revenue stream associated with them, right? So that is something that I think is interesting. I think the blue bonds idea is an interesting one. I think that my understanding of blue bonds is that it has been promoted particularly by small island and developing states thus far. So how it fits with the G7 country, I think is something we're still trying to think about. My colleague, Minister Jordan, who is the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, has been asked to develop a blue economy strategy. And my understanding is that they will be looking at that particular idea in the context of the blue economy strategy. So.
Great, thank you. That was a great question. Seychelles in particular has been a leader in the blue bonds. And,
Seychelles is really interesting, actually, yeah.
Yeah, well, moving forward, thinking still around financing mechanisms and stimulus options, I'll point to Derek for his question.
Yeah, hi, Minister. So yourself, Minister McKenna, and Minister Guilbeault are taking the lead on early stage economic recovery planning within the cabinet. Recently, you met with representatives from the Boston Consulting Group who are helping Canada shape its plan by sharing information about policies and stimulus packages from other countries. The EU, for example, has earmarked funding for electricity production, home efficiency, EVs, zero emission trains, and hydrogen. And some countries like France have also attached green conditions to bailout funding. So I'm curious, from a Canadian perspective, have there been early talks on both green stimulus and green bailouts, so to speak?
Well, let me take those in reverse order. So certainly attaching conditions to some of the liquidity measures that are involved in actually trying to address, especially large industries, yes. We brought into place what we call the LEAF, which is the loan program for large companies, which is really intended to be kind of the last source of finance that large companies should go to their existing sources of finance and work through those unless they really can't access those sources of financing. And so it's structured in such a way that it has reasonably high interest rates so that it's not attractive as a first port of call. But we also put in there that if you are taking money under the LEAF, you actually are going to have to provide climate disclosure on a go-forward basis. and you are going to have to commit to working in a manner that's consistent with Canada's climate goals. So those are elements that really are about trying to ensure that we are moving in the use of public funds, trying to move towards the greener future that we know that we must move towards. We did something similar, as you may have seen, with the energy sector, where there was a lot of discussion around, you know, should the government provide an aid package to workers in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And the decision that we made was we would invest money, but it was really around environmental remediation. So there was $1 billion to clean up orphan wells, which are a huge environmental liability. And there was money to help implement the methane regulations, which are an important part of the climate plan. So rather than backing away from the climate plan, what we said is, okay, let's figure out how to facilitate the work that needs to get done, put people back to work, but address the climate issue. On the recovery, I know the Globe and Mail likes to say that McKenna and Guilbeault and I are leading all of this. Certainly, we are three of the ministers who haven't been as directly involved in the COVID stuff, you know, like Patty Hajdu, the Minister of Health, or Carla Qualtrough, who's had all of the big programs. We certainly have been having lots of conversations, but there are other ministers who have been having lots of conversations. At this point, we're really listening and gathering ideas as to how we actually move forward. I think we all within the government know that we actually need to be thoughtful about some of the things that COVID has made clear to us in terms of gaps in our society or in our economy. But certainly we also all recognize that you know, the looming crisis on the horizon is climate change. And so if we're going to be thinking about moving forward with trying to create the society that we need and we desire, then climate has to be one of the things that we're thinking about for sure.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Great questions. I'm going to call on the last group now who are really keen to discuss climate change and youth inclusion. So we'll kick it off with Christy.
Thanks, Minister. My question is about Canada's climate goals. Canada's recent projections in the 4th biennial report to the UN show that even with all of the additional policies and measures your government has announced that are under development but not fully implemented, Canada's 2030 emissions will only reach 19% below 2005 levels. And that's far less than our 2030 target of 30% below 2005 levels. Yep. And right now, environment climate change data shows us that our annual emissions are virtually identical to our 2005 emissions levels. So what do you think is the largest barrier to Canada meeting its existing Paris Agreement commitments and our 2030 reduction target? And what do you think needs to happen for Canada to step up and meet its international obligation to update our target in 2020 in our nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC?
So it's a good question, and I think the figures that you used are all correct. So if you look at the Pan-Canadian framework, which was developed by Minister McKenna, working in concert with the provinces and territories in 2016, it was really the first credible climate plan Canada's ever had. And what it did was it actually identified the various sources of emissions, but then critical initiatives that could be taken to reduce emissions in all of those spaces. And so if you read through the Pan-Canadian framework, there's about 50 different initiatives ranging from investments in electric vehicle infrastructure to phasing out coal. And it identified, I think it was about 270 megatons in reductions, but that is 77 megatons less than what we need to meet our Paris commitment. And of course, in the last campaign, we said that we would exceed that figure. So what falls to me in my role at this stage is to take what Minister McKenna laid as a foundation and to elaborate that with additional measures that will allow us to provide Canadians visibility on how we will meet and exceed our 2030 targets. That is the work that is going on right now within the department. I will tell you that there are lots of options. Some of them are challenging, there's no question. This is not a simple exercise, and there will be some things that some people won't like. But that's the process that we are working through. Ultimately, we will need to have conversations with the provinces and territories and with people in this country more generally. But our intention is to bring forward a an updated target and ultimately an updated NDC. And NDC is obviously a lot more than just a target before we actually go back to the next COP.
Thanks, Minister. Peninda, off to you.
Hi, Minister. My question is around youth employment in low carbon sectors. We know that young people are one of the groups that have been on the front lines of job insecurity, layoffs, and economic hardships across the country during the COVID crisis, particularly youth from historically marginalized communities. A few of us as youth leaders have prepared an open letter with specific recommendations on how the government can future-proof the Canadian economy by investing in Canada's youth during this time, which we would appreciate the chance to further engage with you on. So my question is related to that. As part of the recovery efforts, what is the government doing to ensure investments in reskilling and youth job creation, particularly in low carbon sectors that put us on a path towards carbon neutrality?
So you are right that the impacts of COVID-19 from an economic perspective, if you look at groups within the society, it is youth, it's women, and from a sector perspective, it's typically the services sector. It's a very unusual economic kind of retraction because that's not the norm. If you went back to 2008 or some of the other issues where we've seen it's looked quite different. And so we are going to need to think creatively about how we ensure people can have the skills to be able to access work, but we're also going to have to think about what that work's going to be. My belief, and I think most people's belief, is we're not going to go back to exactly the way it was before. Things are going to change, some of them for the better, some of them maybe not for the better. Some of it is going to be choices that we make in terms of where we actually want to build back and perhaps where we do not. And I would say to you that there are some things that are obvious coming out of this challenging time, and then there are probably lots of things that are not so obvious. I mean, I think that some of the obvious things are, I mentioned before, the importance of connectivity in this country, and some of the issues we've experienced around offshoring of all of our medical production, both medicines and equipment, food issues around local food and food security, and a number of other things. But certainly as we go forward, one of the things that I think the government and all governments are going to need to think a lot about is significant investments in reskilling, in trying to actually transition. And that will be particularly important, I think, for young people, given the impact, but also given the fact that, you know, I mean, you guys know this. I mean, you know this way better than I do. But the nature of work is changing a lot, and people are going to need to be reskilled and retrained at different times in the course of their career. The type of jobs that existed 30 years ago or 20 years ago, where you went and you got your job at IBM and you worked there for 30 years and you retired with your pension, it just doesn't exist anymore. So I do think that the issues around reskilling, especially for young people, are important, and I would be very happy to see your letter.
Great, thank you. Yes, we would love to engage with you on that.
Awesome. I'll bring it back to Christy because I think you have a follow-up question.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on your statement that we would be putting forward an updated target in a DC before the next COP. As we know, the COP has been postponed to November 2021, but there's still the international obligation to be putting forward an updated target in NDC in 2020. So I just wanted to clarify whether you could make the commitment that the target in NDC would be put forth in 2020, or if you're saying that it might be delayed until 2021.
So certainly our plan before COVID was to do it in 2020, and it would have been to do it before COP. And there were a number of things that were certainly in process prior to March. The world has changed quite a bit. And I will tell you, just the way that the national government works right now is the focus is entirely on COVID right now, in terms of addressing issues associated with COVID-19. So both Parliament and the government are focused almost exclusively on COVID-19. And so it's very difficult to say right now as to when the government is going to go back into a form where we actually are looking at legislation and other issues that are broader than COVID-19. It may be that we get there over the summer, and there may be an opportunity for us to accelerate work, but I will tell you, we've lost a number of months in terms of work that was going on to identify the initiatives that we need to put into place. And so whether we will bring forward the NDC before the end of the year or sometime early in the new year, I just can't say right now. But we will be bringing forward a new NDC.
That's great news. Thank you, Minister. George, would you like to pose a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Dominic, and thank you so much, Minister. I think one of the interesting things about climate action in Canada right now is that we've seen an incredibly strong performance from local governments across the nation of various sizes, big to small. And if we think of the expert panel on sustainable finances recommendations on strengthening the pipeline of local climate action projects, there's a number of reasons to think that local governments continue to be a really strong area to amplify and deliver on a lot of climate commitments. I'm curious if you can speak to any role you could imagine for ECCC and your whole portfolio in advocating for more and stronger fiscal tools for local governments. This has come out in a number of different reports, and obviously that's a priority for some of your colleagues, but I'm curious if you see a specific niche for your role, your portfolio in advocating for, as I say, greater fiscal tools for local governments. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I mean, it's a much broader question than environment and climate change, right? I would say that certainly, we do recognize that municipalities play an important role with respect to climate, including things like public transit, although that's not a thing without some issues right now, but and the need to ensure that the municipalities have some flexibility with respect to fiscal capacity. I mean, you saw yesterday the announcement of the acceleration of the gas tax transfer directly to municipalities from the federal government, which is one of the only real mechanisms other than capital funding for large infrastructure projects that the federal government has vis-a-vis the municipalities. I guess that's certainly a possibility. I mean, it may be in the aftermath of this that there's an opportunity to talk a little bit about the fiscal capacity of all orders of government. But that's not a simple discussion in the context of particularly the federal government, but also the provinces having expended an enormous amount of their fiscal room over the course of the last couple of months. You know very well, municipalities have the challenge that typically it's really property tax that they use to fund everything. And that is largely a function of what the provinces allow them to do, right? Municipalities are creatures of the province, not the federal government. They live because the provinces allow them to live. They get funding sources based on what the provinces decide that they will have. So it certainly would have to be a broader conversation if we were talking about rejigging the fiscal architecture, with the exception of the continued ability of the federal government to try to flow funding through things like the gas tax.
Great, thank you, Minister. Want to point to Natasha, who has a question for us.
Hello, Minister. So my question is going back a little bit to our conversation about incorporating Indigenous knowledge, people and communities into nature-based solutions. So when we think about doing this, and as we go forward into the future doing this, I'm curious how you think that we could support Indigenous communities who experience a lack of access or a lack of infrastructure in this knowledge sharing and in creating these nature-based solutions, and in a way that minimizes or completely eradicates exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, the capacity issue is an important one in terms of being able to engage these conversations, right? And there are some Indigenous communities who have enormous capacity to engage these conversations. I mean, the Squamish Nation here has a lot of capacity to be able to engage across the piece. But there are many other nations across the country which have more limited capacity. And so one of the things that we certainly have thought a lot about is both the short-term and the long-term issues around capacity. The short-term being ensuring that there are supports, for example, in the context of project assessment, to allow affected Indigenous communities to actually have some financial capacity to bring on board the expertise to enable them to engage in a reasonable way. It's not a reasonable thing to do to say, engage in the context of a conversation, but you don't actually have any tools to do that with. There's also, though, the longer term conversation around how do you build capacity more generally so that there's an economic base that provides the resources for the community to actually have resources that exist on a long-term basis. And again, there are some stories of success there. I mean, the work that when I was in Fisheries and Oceans, we did with the coastal First Nations here in British Columbia was really around actually creating a mechanism that allowed the community to become the largest, quite a bit by far, owner of licenses with respect to the fishery and boats and gear and everything else, so that you could employ people, you could actually ensure that you were creating economic returns off of that industry, such that you could enhance capacity on an ongoing basis.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've got so many great questions. We're close to the end of the hour, but I do want to read one from the broader audience that we've received. So I'll just read it out because I think they're muted. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. My name is Blake, here along with Anna and Pierre-Olivier, the 2020 Parks Canada Youth Ambassadors, responsible for some of our public outreach initiatives targeted at youth. Parks Canada, along with provincial and local park systems, have seen a surge in visitation during the COVID-19 pandemic and are expecting this to continue. Over-tourism has been a prevalent factor to consider in the protection of our places and can directly affect conservation practices. The question is, how will we ensure sustainable balance between conservation and tourism, ensuring a productive economy without negatively impacting our valuable conservation work? Do you see digital outreach playing a role in this? And how can youth support this balance?
It's an important question. I mean, I think that in past, we perhaps have gone too far with some of the national parks on the tourism side, and probably have maybe not been rigorous enough on the conservation side. I think that has changed over the last little while. I think Parks Canada is, the focus of Parks Canada and the very explicit direction that Minister McKenna gave them is the focus is on ecological integrity. And so some of the parks where there has been a reasonable amount of development, think, Banff or Jasper, that the park planning process now is such that it would be very, very difficult to see significant additional development in those parks. But certainly we do need to try to ensure that we're managing our park system in a thoughtful way. We were worried about this when we had Canada 150. We did a lot of work to ensure the parks didn't get overwhelmed. We probably will have to do some of that again this year, although the parks were closed until 3 days ago. And we have opened them up now just for day use. We eventually will open them up for camping, and in a context where people can't travel internationally, there probably will be a lot of folks who want to go to the parks. And so we will need to be thoughtful about how we manage that to ensure that we're not overloading some of the parks. So it's really an issue for a few parks. It's not really an issue, for example, for the parks in the far north. And that is something that I think we can take learnings from Canada 150 in terms of doing that. But I would say that I do think that digital outreach actually potentially can play a role, probably in two different ways. I mean, one is outreach to help us manage surges. So, Parks Canada developed a number of tools during Canada 150 to try to ensure that we were notifying people not to come. We were finding ways to communicate with people if we actually thought there were too many people. But the other is, one of my big things in parks is trying to figure out ways to get people to be closer to nature, especially in an environment where many people live in urban places but probably never been to a wild space. And I think there are digital tools and other modern tools like drones and stuff where you can actually bring the parks to people rather than bringing people to the parks. And so I think that's something that we're trying to explore a little bit about in Parks Canada.
Thank you, Minister. We're just closing off, but Robin has a really great question to close it off for us. Robin, off to you.
Thanks, Dom. So my question is, has the government started to think about how we can raise Black and Indigenous-led climate and nature-based solutions? And if they have, I know the group on this call would love to help support this and bring an anti-racist lens to the climate work we're doing here in Canada.
I would say with respect to nature-based solutions, there's been a lot of thinking about that with respect to Indigenous peoples, probably less with respect to Black and other racialized communities. But certainly in the Indigenous area, I would tell you that much of the work that we have done with respect to conservation has been Indigenous-led. We announced the Canada Nature Fund a couple of years ago, which was $1 billion to go towards actually protecting wild spaces. Of the, I think 60, 50, 55, 60 program initiatives that were announced under that, a large majority were actually Indigenous-led. And that includes some of the largest protected spaces that we've been able to protect in Canada's history, including, I mentioned Imanga, but also Last Ice in the north, and that was led by the Inuit leadership. In British Columbia, the Jumbo Project. I mean, there's a whole range of them across this country, which, I think Indigenous peoples, as you folks will know very well, I mean, Indigenous peoples obviously are much closer, I think, to the land than many other groups in this society. And so the importance of conservation and protection and the sustainability of biodiversity is something that is extremely important. And so if that's a priority for the government, it's certainly been a priority for Indigenous peoples, and they have helped to lead in terms of actually making progress.
Thank you, Minister. We'd love to continue the conversation, but we're running out of time. So I'd invite you, Minister, if you have any final words you'd like to share with us.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to have a chat today. You folks are a very impressive group of young people. Really good questions. I quite enjoy these sessions. I'd be very happy to do more of them if, in fact, that's of interest to you guys. But I'd also be really interested in hearing, if you have ideas about things you think we should be considering, bring them forward, send them to me. As I said earlier, with respect to sort of where we're at, I think there's kind of an opportunity for us to take a step back and look at how do we make transformational change on some of the big issues that are confronting us. And at this stage right now, we're really just looking for ideas. And so to the extent that you have ideas you think are important, that you think we should think about, send them.
All right, we definitely have a lot of ideas, that's for sure. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to building a better future together, really. This is really an important moment. And yeah, we look forward to creating more spaces like this where we can get more young people sharing their ideas. And again, thank you to our youth representatives for these awesome questions, and I'll pass it over to Megan.
Well, and thank you, Dominique, for doing an excellent job moderating today's discussion. And of course, to Minister Wilkinson and the whole team at Environment and Climate Change Canada for making this opportunity possible. Dang, this was a great conversation. And we encourage everyone who's joined us online to stay connected and keep the momentum going. As mentioned at the beginning of this call, there are a number of ways Leading Change supports opportunities for civil dialogue and youth engagement around sustainability issues. So we encourage you, follow our social media channels, follow the profiles and organizations of the youth represented on this call. And merci tout le monde. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.